Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and we return now to 1980 for an unusual Star Wars comic strip. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler. This time we're taking a look at Han Solo at Star's End. No, you're not having deja vu here. We have looked at Han Solo at Star's End before, only this time we're looking at it from a different angle. This time we're looking at it as a comic strip. By October 1980, Russ Manning was no longer on the Star Wars comic strip. He would pass away. We had also seen Archie Goodwin come in, writing under the name of Russ Helm for Planet of Cadrill. There was supposed to be one more story before the entire comic strip went away. That was the adaptation of Brian Daley's novel Han Solo at Star's End. This is the original novel, released just the year before, 1979. If you're not familiar with this version of it, you may be more familiar with the omnibus edition Han Solo Adventures that is more likely to be seen on store shelves these days, or and used bookstore shelves these days. Kind of hard to find the original 1979 editions at this point. The Han Solo at Star's End adaptation is odd in a number of ways. It's a comic strip that adapts a previously existing story. In terms of comic strips doing that, it is the first and only time that has happened. In terms of comics in general doing that, it's still fairly rare. We've seen things like Splinter of the Mind's Eye get a comic adaptation, we saw the Thrawn trilogy get comic book adaptations, but not in this particular era. It's also unique in that it is the only one of Brian Daley's Star Wars novels to get a comic adaptation. Han Solo's Revenge and Han Solo and the Lost Legacy did not each get one. It was also the last of the comic strips to have its Sunday strips in full color. Future comic strips would wind up being only in black and white. Now I say future, and I just said though a moment ago this was to be the last one. What's the deal? Well, think Star Trek in a sense. There was a letter writing campaign, a petition, essentially a push for the LA Times Syndicate to keep going with Star Wars stories, and they saw enough of feedback from the readers to say, you know what? We will keep it going. And they wound up picking up with Archie Goodwin to go forward, starting with Bounty Hunter of Ord Mantell, the first one to be reprinted in the regular classic Star Wars series that you may have seen before. We'll eventually wind up getting to that in the near future here. But this story is one that was released, again, as a comic strip, right? So something like this, give or take, on any single day, right? Just either a panel or two or three. Not all that much. Eventually, those original panels were released on StarWars.com for the hyperspace section before it became, as I mentioned before, a dumbed-down Look at the Pretty Pictures website. And later, it was given the classic Star Wars treatment of being recolored and put into single comic book form through Dark Horse Comics as Han Solo at Star's End, numbers 1, 2, and 3. So we got a chance to see that in single comic form, just like the other classic Star Wars series, plus we wound up seeing that collected, of course, in a trade paperback, as usually happens with single issues from Dark Horse. Now, one thing is interesting about this. I don't want to go into the story and everything. We did that before when talking about the book. But there is an oddity here, and I find it bizarre. There's a character named Triani. And if you have if you have read this recently, in the Dark Horse version of this, the one that was re-released as Classic Star Wars, Han Solo at Star's End. These are the Triani characters here, okay? They look like cats. They look very much like cats in almost every respect here, okay? Just walking cats. Interestingly enough, yeah, we got Cathar and such, so you're like, yeah, what's the big deal? They look like cats. There's other ones that look like cats. The big deal is, look how they looked in the actual comic strip. Those are not the same kind of cats, in a sense here. It's page 11 is the one that I'm using if you're looking at the actual comic. Let me sit these side by side for you here. Not only did they colorize the art, they redid the art only in the case of the Triani, to make them look different, I guess more in keeping with what they did perhaps with other Triani later in the EU. It's just an odd choice of how they decided to do this. For what it's worth, if you want to put these things in perspective, that original version with the more human-looking faces on the cat people, on the Triani, that was, again, it's October of 1980 up through February of 1981. This series that adapts it all was released in 1997. So there was a lot of time that passed between the two. It just seems odd that of all the things to correct, that's the one thing they decided to correct or change in this particular edition. Doesn't affect the story at all. It's just an odd aesthetic change that would have been interesting to find more detail about why they did it. I've heard it explained several different ways, and the different ways tend to be somewhat contradictory, so it seems odd that there isn't some obvious reason for it, quite honestly. As for this story, is it a good read? I mean, the book reads better, but you'd kind of expect that for something like this. It's a decent enough read if you want to just jump into Han Solo's Revenge and Han Solo and the Lost Legacy without having to read Han Solo that stars in the novel. You could just read this, but I'd probably recommend going ahead and reading the novel instead. It's just a much better read than the way that it handles whenever you got something that's essentially a serialized comic strip that now is taken and had some of the redundancies yanked out of it. So is this, as we always say, an essential read? No. The comic strip version of this is not an essential read because we have the novel. The novel in and of itself is not an essential read either. Not even if you're just reading the Han Solo adventures, you can jump in just with Han Solo's Revenge, quite frankly. It's an interesting read, though, and a unique piece in Star Wars publishing, being that adaptation of a novel long before that became something that was done, even in moderate fashion, by Dark Horse Comics. Nice move on LA Times Newspaper Syndicate's part, though it seems odd that they didn't do any more of it. Would have been kind of cool to see the entire trilogy done this way, quite frankly. So, with that, we'll wrap this episode up. Thank you for watching, and as always, may the Force be with the readers.